Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar session in this series called Grow With Me. My name is Melissa, and I am a speech therapist with Summers Therapy Services. So my topic for today is called Language Beyond Preschool. We will see how children use their language for learning once they are in school. This is our agenda for today. I will talk about the foundational language that children need once they enter into school and the language that they will need that builds on this foundation that helps them with learning in school. And I will also talk about the assessment and intervention that us as speech therapists can do to help children with language difficulties in school. If you have any questions today, please send them in the chat and we will answer them in our question and answer section just after this webinar session. All right, so let's dive in. Oral language skills are the foundation for literacy development and for learning in school. During the first 6 years of a child's life, when he develops basic and foundational oral language skills, this is what he will use for expressing needs and wants and for interacting with immediate family members and friends. When children enter primary school, then we expect their foundational oral language development to be adequate to support their ongoing learning. So as they move from one school grade to the next, we expect them to use their language, not just to communicate, but also to learn. So oral language skills lay the foundation for learning to read and write. Reading is more than just a visual skill. It is primarily a language-based skill. When children enter school and when their formal reading instruction starts, their oral language skills will help them to understand what they are reading. So once children have learned how to read words, it is important that they also understand the words and the sentences that they are reading. So the same language foundation that helps us understand spoken language is also what helps us to understand what we read. So that is why when children have oral language difficulties, it may also affect their reading comprehension. This illustration we have just seen in the previous webinar session, and it illustrates how successful reading has two main components, namely language comprehension and word recognition. And these two components are like the strands of a rope woven together so that we get skilled reading. So we are able to recognize words and read the actual word, and we are also able to understand what we are reading. And both of these skills work together to help us to understand what we read. So if we look at this illustration, we see that there may be different reasons why children may struggle to read. So some children have dyslexia, which refers to problems in word recognition. They may have difficulty decoding the words and reading what the words are saying. So this refers to the bottom part of this illustration, the word recognition part. And then some other children, they may not have dyslexia, but they still have difficulties in reading. They may be able to decode the words just fine, but they may have difficulties with language comprehension. That is the top part of this illustration. And because of the language comprehension difficulties, they may not be able to understand what they read and therefore have reading difficulties. And some children may have reading difficulties because of both of these components, a word recognition difficulty and also a language comprehension difficulty. So as speech and language therapists, we are interested in reading from a language perspective. So when children's language comprehension difficulties also affect their ability to read. So let's zoom into the language comprehension strand, the top part of this illustration. And I will explain how oral language difficulties and difficulties in language comprehension may lead to reading difficulties for children in school. So first we have background knowledge. Our general knowledge of the world is built up by a wide variety of experiences. And if children don't have sufficient general knowledge of the world, it will be difficult for them to understand the stories that they're reading. And this links with our vocabulary knowledge. If children have a small and limited vocabulary, they may not be able to understand large portions of the stories that they are reading. So even if they can decode and read the words, they may not be able to understand what the words mean. Then we have language structure. When children have language difficulties, they may have difficulties understanding and using the word structure and the sentence structure of the language. And, and then they may also have difficulties to understand the word and the sentence structure in the texts, the stories that they are reading. Verbal reasoning is an important skill to understand what we are reading, because some parts of the story are not always explicitly stated. So we need verbal reasoning skills like inferencing skills to infer those parts of a story that is not directly stated in the story. And when children have difficulties with inferencing skills and verbal reasoning skills, it may be difficult for them to understand what the author means in the story that they're reading. And then finally, literacy knowledge. So usually we have an understanding of the general structure of a story and how the story flows from the beginning to the end. So when children have difficulty understanding a story structure, or they have difficulties in following the flow of the story sequence from the beginning to the end, it may be difficult for them to understand the main idea of the story. So during lower primary, children will learn how to read, and eventually their decoding skills, their reading skills will become more fluent, and then we expect them to also understand what they are reading. So as children move from the lower primary grades to the upper primary grades and onwards, they move on from learning to read to using their reading to learn, to use what they are reading in the texts and to understand what they are reading to learn and move on in school. So then children with language difficulties in the upper primary grades may struggle then with reading if they do not understand what they read. So their language difficulties may hinder their understanding of the words and the sentences that they are reading. They may also have difficulties in understanding what the author means if they have difficulties with inferencing skills, and they may also have difficulties following the structure and the sequence of the story. And all these hinder their language comprehension. So this is why then in this webinar session, we will focus on this language comprehension strand of skilled reading. And we will talk about how children's oral language skills help them in reading comprehension. So firstly, we will look at foundational language development during preschool, and how once the children enter into primary school, what is the language skills that build on their foundational skills? What are those language skills that they need beyond preschool, that they need in primary school to learn and succeed in school? And these are narrative development and verbal reasoning skills, which we will look at in detail. All right, let's look first at foundational language development. During the first 6 years, children develop foundational language skills. So then by the time children enter primary school, their language foundation will be strong enough to help them participate in the classroom and to interact with the teacher and their school friends. So once in school, children are expected to listen and follow what the teacher is talking about and to answer the questions that she may have in the class. Children are also expected to contribute to classroom discussions and to write compositions. And this is how where their foundational language development come in to help them with this. Dr. Marion Blank is a developmental psychologist who specializes in language and learning, and she has studied the language that teachers use in the classroom. And she has found that there are 4 different levels of questions that teachers usually use. So these 4 levels of questions develop during the preschool years. And then by the time children enter primary school, they should be able to understand these questions in order to follow along in the classroom. So let's look at each of these levels in detail. On the screen here, you can see the 4 levels set out. I will go through each one of them. So let's start with the first level. So the naming level is when children can answer questions about the basic and concrete information about an object or a picture. And this develops around 3 years old. So for example, children start to understand how to match objects. If we ask them, find one like this, for example, if we look at this illustration picture and I point, for example, to one tomato and ask the child, find one like this, and he points to another tomato, or point to a bottle, find one like this, and he points to another bottle. Or just naming objects, people, or actions. For example, children at this level understand basic WH questions. For example, what and who. And so, for example, if we look at this picture and we point to the knife and ask, what is this? Or point to the bowl, what is this? Who questions, we can point to the mommy and ask, who is this? We can point to the girl, who is this? And then another question we can ask at this level, what is the mommy doing? What is the girl doing? So at this level, children can understand basic who, what, and what doing questions about the basic and concrete aspects of a picture or an item. Then the second level is the describing level that develops around 4 years old. This is when children are able to talk about or answer questions about the less obvious features of objects or pictures. For example, we can ask just a general question about this picture, what happened or what is happening here? And the child can say the mommy is cooking dinner and the girl is helping. So it is, not a specific question, but a general question of what is happening. Then at this level, children are also able to identify and describe the characteristics of objects. For example, if we ask them, I point to the bottle, what size is the bottle? I can point to the tomato. What shape is the tomato? I can ask what color is the tomato and how many tomatoes are there. And then also children are understanding where questions at this level. So I can ask, where is this? Where is this happening? And namely that will be in the kitchen. Then the third level is the identify level. This is when children can talk about and answer questions about objects in a variety of ways, and then also in more abstract ways. And this level develops around 4.5 years old. So for example, if we look at this picture as an example, we can ask, we can ask children to identify the similarities between objects. For example, if I point to the ball and the balloon, children will ask a question like, how are these two the same? How is the ball and the balloon the same? And they are both round. Then children will also be able to identify what objects can be used together with another one, like what objects are associated with one another. For example, if I point to the bucket, I can ask, tell me something else that you can use with the bucket. And then the child would point to the spade. The spade and the bucket are used together. So here at this level, children are also able to identify the logical order of events. If I ask them, tell me the beginning or the middle or the end of our day at the playground, tell me a story of our day at the playground, and then to tell a logical story and a logical order of events. All right. Then at the fourth level, this is the predicting level, the reasoning level, that develops around 5 to 6 years old. So this is when children can talk about and answer questions about what causes things to happen. And they are able to make predictions about what will happen next. So for example, in this picture, children will be able to answer questions like, what happened to the boy? Or a more abstract question like, what will happen if we ride our bicycle too fast? We will fall down. And then they can also start to understand and answer questions like why? Why questions? Like, why did the boy fall? Or why will we fall if we ride too fast? And at this level, children will also be able to provide solutions to the problem. For example, we can ask, what could we do to help the boy? Or what can we use if his knee is bleeding? What can we put on the knee to stop the bleeding? And then lastly, here at this level, children can also start to predict and describe what might happen next. For example, what will the boy do next? And explain what he might be doing. So these 4 levels of question comprehension forms the foundation of language comprehension skills and the expressive language skills that children need once they enter into primary school. So this language foundation will help children in school to understand what the teacher is asking and instructing. And it will also continue to help children understand the questions that they read in the textbooks and what they read, the content that they read in the textbooks, especially in the upper primary school grades and beyond. So let's move on to language beyond preschool. So this is the language skills that children need once they enter primary school that build on their foundational language, the foundation language that they already have developed until now. So in primary school, we see that they would need narrative skills and verbal reasoning skills. So let's look at each one of these. So narrative development, that is especially important during the lower primary grades. Children's narrative skills develop through a series of stages. As their language start to develop, their narrative skills develop also through a series of stages. So during the preschool years, children learn how to sequence events and tell them in a logical order, like we have just seen in the previous section on the foundational language development. So then around 4 years old, children have developed what we call primitive narrative stage, where there are typically three elements in a story, namely an initiating event that starts the story off, secondly, an action that follows on this initiating event, and some consequences that also follows the action and the initiating event. Then around 5 years old, children typically use what we call chain narratives. And now this includes 4 story elements. So it also starts to include a plan or a motivation for why the characters in the story will do certain things. There's some cause and effect elements in the story now. Then by 5 to 7 years old, and then especially when children enter into primary school, their narrative skills have developed to this, what we call true narratives. So true narratives usually include 5 story elements: the initiating event, the action, some consequences, a plan or a motivation behind the character's actions, plus an ending that shows some resolution to the problem in the story. So this is where it becomes important in the lower primary grades, because in the lower primary grades, children's ability to tell these true narratives begins to link with their ability to understand reasoning questions. So children can now identify a problem in the story and the possible reason why it happened. They can come up with some possible solutions to this problem, and they can reason which of these solutions might be the best one to end their story. And then from 8 years old to 13 years old, this is where children's narratives become more complex and longer, and includes more complex story plots, including inferencing and problem-solving events. And this is more applicable to the upper primary grades, which we will talk about later. So children with language difficulties, often they will experience delays in storytelling as well, and they may have difficulty in telling and retelling stories. Their stories are often shorter, and they have fewer story elements included in the story. They may also use fewer complex sentences in the story and some maybe limited vocabulary. And their stories may be overall less organized and less cohesive. The flow of the story may not go through the logical stages of a story. And they may also show less attention to the characters' feelings and motivations behind the actions. So delays and difficulties in storytelling may also lead to difficulties in school with oral and written composition tasks, and also in reading comprehension tasks. So children may struggle to understand the sequence of stories, and they may have difficulties to understand and identify what is the main idea in the story. So these difficulties may become greater once they move on to the upper primary grades and beyond. So in the upper primary grades, they are required to read and understand longer texts, and then also learn from what they are reading. So if it's difficult for them to understand what they are reading, it will also be difficult for them to learn from what they are reading. So for preschool and primary school children with language difficulties, we as speech therapists will do assessments for language development, specifically for narrative development, and will also include narrative development activities in our language intervention program for children with language difficulties. It is really important that we build up children's narrative skills from preschool age. This is when the foundational language develops. So we need their foundational language skills to be adequate to support their reading comprehension once they enter into school. Next, let's look at verbal reasoning skills. That is becoming more important once children enter into the upper primary grade levels. And here, verbal reasoning skills include inferencing, predicting, and integrating information while we are reading. So inferencing and predicting, when we are reading, we often need to make inferences about information in the story that are not explicitly stated. So much of our understanding of stories require that we have to read between the lines or make inferences about the setting, the characters' emotions, and the context. So we often need to infer why the characters did what they did, and we have to make predictions of what might happen next in the story. So for example, if we read the following, she was outside riding her bicycle when she heard the flapping of wings under the bushes. She left her bicycle right there and ran inside to get a shoebox. So in understanding this story, we need to infer that this is about a girl who finds an injured bird and that she is planning to rescue and care for it. Our inferencing skills help us to use the information that is given in what we have just read in the story to infer those things that are not directly stated. Then we have to integrate the information, all the information together. So understanding what we read involves that we pull together ideas from the different sentences in the text, but then also to integrate what we read with the information that was given earlier with the whole context and to integrate it with our background knowledge. So for example, when we read this part of the story, the family was ready for the picnic. Everyone got into the car and they drove to the park. When they got to the park and opened the boot, they found they had forgotten to bring the picnic mat. So here we need to infer that the family put what they would need for the picnic in the boot earlier before they left, even though this was not explicitly stated. So then this information that was given in the story and what we have inferred, we have to integrate this with our background knowledge. For example, our background knowledge tells us and helps us to know that a car has a boot to put things inside. And we also know all the things that we would need to go on a picnic. We also know from our background knowledge what a park looks like, and we also know why we would need a picnic mat to sit on the grass. So what we read and what we infer are all integrated with our existing background knowledge to have a good, accurate understanding of what we are reading in a story. So especially in the higher primary grades, children start to rely more on inferencing and verbal reasoning skills to have good comprehension. So by the time they enter the upper primary grades, the kind of textbooks that they are reading starts to change. So the reading that they will have to do, the text becomes more descriptive written texts rather than a story form. The text become longer and it does also not have a predictable narrative structure or context. Written language also differ from spoken language. Spoken language, with spoken language, we have a bigger context like facial expressions, gestures, or a common topic that we are talking about to help us with understanding what we are hearing. But written language often do not have a context to help us with so much with comprehension. It also written language also discuss unfamiliar ideas, new information, abstract ideas, and abstract vocabulary. And the textbooks become also more subject-specific topics. So in the higher primary grades, children they will need to read and understand science and social studies textbooks, and even for completing mathematics sums, the problem sums in mathematics, children will need to understand what they're reading. So in order to understand the concepts in science and social studies and be able to complete problem sums, children need to have the foundational language to understand concepts, for example, before and after, bigger and smaller, more than or less than, and as well as have the ability to use their problem solving skills and inferencing skills. So the further children progress into the upper primary school and secondary school grades, the more children need to rely on their reading skills to learn and to comprehend these various subjects. This is where earlier in the lower primary grades, they have learned to read, and now they are more and more using their reading skills to learn and understand these more complex textbooks and subjects. So children with language difficulties then often struggle to make this transition from the lower primary grades to the upper primary grades. So where they change over from learning to read to reading to learn and having to use their reading skills to understand the textbooks, it may become difficult for them because they will have difficulty in understanding the complex sentences and also understanding the text. If children do not have a strong oral language foundation, they may have difficulty in keeping up with the changes of the curriculum as they move along. So for language intervention, this is why we as speech therapists are interested in helping and supporting children with language difficulties in school to help them with language comprehension that will eventually help them with learning. So during the assessment and intervention of older children, school-age children with language difficulties, we as speech therapists, we will not only focus on the basic oral language skills to assess that, but we also do an assessment of children's narrative skills and those higher order language skills like inferencing, verbal reasoning skills that children need for successful reading and for learning in school. So for language therapy and intervention for school-age children who have language difficulties, it is recommended that we focus on teaching them verbal reasoning and inferencing skills, to integrate oral and written language, and to provide the intervention within the curriculum. Let's look at each one of these in detail. So when we teach verbal reasoning and inferencing skills, we teach children how to make inferences and how to link what they read with their general background knowledge to eventually understand what they read. So we can teach children how to infer where and when something happened. So for example, when children read a story or read a text, we can teach them how to identify where something is happening, when it is happening, by using their general background knowledge of what usually happens at a setting like this and what we know about the setting to make some conclusions of where and when it is happening. We can also teach children to infer the reason why something is happening. Again, to use clues from the text or from a picture and from our general knowledge to identify what is happening and to identify a possible cause or a reason why it is happening. And this could then also be linked with specific vocabulary words like because, so, or since, to help the child to learn how to say why something happened. Next, we can also teach children how to predict what will happen, how to use clues from the picture, from a text, and again from general knowledge to predict what might be the logical thing that might happen next in the story. And then also feelings. We can help children to infer the feelings of the characters in the story, how to make inferences about their feelings by identifying their facial expressions or body language, maybe if it's in a picture or if it's in a text, to identify specific language that is used to describe the character's feelings. And then once children learn how to identify the character's feelings, it will help them to understand what happened in the story or predict what the character may do next and why. Secondly, in intervention, we will also integrate oral and written language. It is important that we help children to pull together their reading skills and their oral language skills to help them to understand what they are reading and to progress in school. So we will combine oral narrative skills with reading comprehension, writing, and spelling, and together with teaching verbal reasoning skills. We will teach them how to use their background knowledge and also to intentionally improve their vocabulary skills to all support their overall reading comprehension. So for example, we can teach children to use specific strategies before, during, and after reading a portion of text. For example, before reading, the student can think of what he already knows about the topic. And then during reading, he can restate what he is reading in his own words and identify the main idea of each paragraph and maybe write that down. Then after reading, we can ask the student what he has learned. He can describe what he has learned and how it relates to what he knew about this topic before he started to read. Then thirdly, it is important that we support children with language difficulties within the curriculum context. So our goal is to provide functional improvement in literacy and reading comprehension within the school curriculum. So we, as speech therapists, we can collaborate with the school teacher to help build children's background knowledge, their language skills, and their verbal reasoning skills specifically related to curriculum topics such as science, history, math, and literature. We could also help children to improve their vocabulary and their specific knowledge of vocabulary that is found in these subject texts. We can teach them how to infer a meaning of a word if they don't know a word. So we can help teach them to infer the meaning of unfamiliar word from the context in order to have a better understanding of what they are reading. And then it is also important that we continue to provide support and intervention to build their language skills, to specifically understand complex sentence structures. And then again, we can work on specifically in these curriculum texts like the science, history, maths, and literature to support their understanding of complex sentences that are found in their textbooks. All these intervention strategies have the goal of functionally improving the child's reading comprehension, to be able to understand what he is reading and understand what he is reading and to make good progress in school. So today we saw in this webinar session, we saw that oral language skills are truly the foundation for when children enter primary school. when they learn to read, because this language foundation helps and supports their reading comprehension. So successful reading needs comprehension of the narrative structure and having good verbal reasoning skills, like inferencing skills. And these all work together to help children understand what they read and progress in school. So it is important that we provide early intervention for children with language difficulties to start during preschool to build up children's language foundation, and then to continue in the lower and upper primary school levels to continue to support children with language difficulties, to support their language and to support their reading comprehension or learning. Thank you very much for joining this session. If you have any further questions, please feel free to contact us at the following addresses. But for now, you can also type in your questions, and right after this, we will answer some questions. Thank you.